Welcome everyone to this live stream. It's actually the final live stream of our 15 days of our virtual online symposium on worship from Calvin University and Calvin Theological Seminary. It's been a wonderful 15 days. We have some more coming up today. In addition to all the standing content, there'll be our final worship service with our brother Luke Powery will go live this afternoon at 3 from Duke, and so you want to be sure to tune in on that as sort of the finale of the symposium and of the very sermon series we're going to talk about. My name is Scott Jose. I'm the director of the Center for Excellence in Preaching at Calvin Theological Seminary, a sister institution to the Worship Institute, and a co-sponsor of the symposium every year. So we're glad to be able to be together for the next little while. Just by way of background, at our symposium on worship every year now for quite a long time, we have chosen a theme that unites our 5 primary worship services. It's usually a book of the Bible or a certain set of passages. We've done Psalms, we've done Exodus, we've done 2 Corinthians, Hebrews, a lot of different ones. And at our 5 primary worship services, when we're all in person on campus here, that's sort of the thread that unites those services. For this year, we decided, even though we're going to be virtual and even though we were going to have a lot of other worship services that we would record from around the world, we still wanted to have a uniting theme for our primary services. And this time it was 6 primary services. And as we thought about the situation of the global pandemic, as we thought about the racial reckoning that happened, particularly in the United States, and all the circumstances that all of us all around the world faced throughout 2020 and that we continue now to face in 2021, it seemed that Romans 8 was the passage to go to. We decided that pretty early on last fall. Romans 8, with its encouraging words, and yet with its empathetic words, and yet with its soaring crescendo words that Luke will preach on at the service that will go live this afternoon, it all seemed to fit. So we approached 6 pastors, and 5 of them are with us on this call. Mark Laberton from Fuller Theological Seminary was not able to join us this morning, but we had we carved out 6 preaching passages from Romans 8. And so what we want to do in this next little while is hear from the preachers, all of whom you've had the chance to hear, except for Luke, who will be up this afternoon. But we wanted them to reflect a little bit about how their particular text hit them as they got ready for preaching, and in what their context is. So we've got a few of us here from the United States, Eric and Luke and Mary, but we also have our sister Anne from Cairo and our sister Najla from Beirut. So different contexts as well. So what I want to do first is just have each of you just briefly introduce yourselves, remind us where you are, what your ministry context is, and then I'll come back to each of you in turn and we'll kind of go in the order of the passage and let you take a few minutes to describe what preparing your sermon in this time in your context was like. So let's just go around. We'll start with Mary, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Hulst. I serve as the university pastor at Calvin University, where I've been for 12 years.
Okay, thank you. Anne?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anne Zaki, and I serve as the Preaching and Practical Theology professor at the Evangelical Theological Seminary in Cairo, and I've been in that position for 8 years.
Wonderful. Thank you. Najla?
I'm Najla Kassab. I'm the president of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. I'm also the director of the Christian Education Department in the National Evangelical Synod of Syria and Lebanon, which is the Presbyterian Church.
Okay, wonderful. Eric?
Hello, friends. Eric Barreto. I teach New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary. So I'm in Princeton, New Jersey, in my home, by way of the most beautiful island in the world, the island of Puerto Rico. We all know this. It's not debatable.
Wonderful. Luke?
Hi, everyone. I'm Luke Powery. I serve as the Dean of Duke University Chapel in Durham, North Carolina, and also a professor of homiletics at Duke Divinity School. And I've been here 8.5 years.
Terrific. Thank you. Well, again, welcome to you all. And again, a nod to Mark Laberton as well, who had the second sermon in this Romans 8 series. So we'll start with you, Mary. Talk a little bit about what's going on in your context, what preaching on Romans 8, you have verses 1 through 8, the famous no condemnation passage. So yeah, take it away.
Yeah, so my context is preaching to primarily students who are between the ages of 18 and 22. They come from around the world. We have about 25% of them who are students of color. About 70% of them come from some form of a Christian church, often non-denom. 30-ish% of them come from a Reformed background, Christian Reformed, Presbyterian, RCA. And our worship services are usually every day, and they're for 20 minutes. And so my normal preaching has to fit in that very tight window. Calvin students tend to be high achieving, and as many of us who work with young adults know, the rates of mental health, anxiety, depression are skyrocketing. And so as I was thinking about there is now no condemnation, I thought about how often I hear from students condemnation for themselves coming out of their own mouths. I should have done this differently. I'm not good at this. I'm not going to make it. Other people here are better, smarter, whatever than I am. I just don't get it. And while my students are maybe a little more upfront about that, I think many of us have that challenge too. And what's really odd about this pandemic season is that we all feel like we should do the pandemic in the best way possible. Like we should conquer the pandemic. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, there were all these things about what are you achieving during the pandemic? And how many times didn't we hear Shakespeare wrote an entire play during his pandemic. And we were all like, whoa, if I don't write a play, if I don't write a book, if I don't write. So everyone's baking bread and coming up with schedules for their children. And then 6, 8, 10 weeks into it, we're all like, shut it down. Shut it. It's not going to work. No, it's all about survival. And yet there was still something, I think, in the back of so many of our minds, am I doing the pandemic right? Am I doing Zooming, teaming, WebExy life correctly? And there was even this well, some of my colleagues are working just so hard on the COVID thing, and am I working hard enough on things? And so the trouble in the text, to use a structure that may be familiar to some of you, the trouble in the text is pretty clear. And the trouble in the world is pretty clear. We are really good at condemning ourselves. And so the counter of there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, you have to say what that was like for Paul. And so I was really clear that he himself probably dealt with his own condemnation and the own replays of his own sins in his mind, and how we do that too. And yet the resurrection of Jesus Christ changes everything, which is why we have the move from Romans 7, I can't do what I want to do, the things I don't want to do, I do, to Romans 8, is because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so forefronting the resurrection allows us to listen to the voice of Jesus rather than the voice of condemnation. And for my students to giving the more specific I can be about what that looks like to listen to the voice of God, what it means that there's no condemnation. I need to draw really clear lines from this to this. Some of them just became Christians a year or two ago. Some of them have been Christians a long time, but they don't know scripture or they don't know theology. And so the more specific I am and the more clear I am about how scripture ties itself to our lives, the better off I'm going to be and the more helpful I'll be to my community. So that's a beginning anyway. Thanks, Scott.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, not for nothing are we called Calvin, right? I mean, we're totally depraved even in the pandemic.
That's right.
Can't even get the pandemic right. Anyway, thanks, Mary, for that start. So the next sermon in the series was the sort of on the realm of the Spirit. That was Mark, who's not with us. So then we'll go to Ann, who had Romans 8:14-17, talked about the Spirit and how we're children of God. So Ann, talk about your context in Cairo, the sermon, what you see as the needs in the church where you preached your sermon. So Ann, take it away.
Thank you, Scott. Before I talk about my context in Cairo, I will talk about my context in my own apartment, because I was actually sick with COVID when I was writing the sermon. So I was out for 20 days. I didn't leave my home for 22 days. And the first time I came out was the day that I preached. And so that to me was a very significant message, a personal message. Since last March, and I was one of the people who would send messages to people who are sick and saying, just focus on God and just listen to what God is trying to tell you now. And honestly, after I went through it myself, I thought, oh, that was horrible. How could I have done this to others? Because I was so sick and so tired. I was sleeping all the time. And I thought, there's no chance for God to talk to me unless he appears in a dream. I mean, I was just sleeping the whole time. And so I couldn't hear anything from God. I couldn't say anything to God. I was really, really sick. And so at some point, as I was thinking about the sermon, laying on my back, just counting the hours, taking my meds, being isolated from everybody, worrying about, did I pass it on to someone without knowing? Who did I get it from? I live next door to my parents who are elderly, and I thought, this would be really awful if by any chance I passed this to them or to my children or to my husband. So for me, it was a moment of finally giving up on trying to find God in this and letting God find me. And the title of the sermon that I was given, I would not have chosen that title because I just thought that's just it's too obvious in the text. We need something just more subtle, more clever. Like, why call it children of God? That's just too obvious. And it needs to be something more witty, more, But that sermon title is what kept coming back to me of, I'm a child of God. You are my child. That's what matters. Everything else will be taken care of. You are my child. I will take care of you in your sickness. And if I choose to bring you now to me, I will take care of everybody else you leave behind. All is well, and it was a really reassuring message for me. And then I had to get up and preach this, pretending like I'm healthy and strong and actually have energy to get up and preach. By the way, after I preached it, I went and I took a 4-hour nap just because I was so exhausted. But standing there, speaking to a church that is generally very communal, we meet 6 days a week at church. We have nightly services. And when we're not at church, we're together. And after we're at church, we're also together. And we are a night culture. And so once church is done, say about 9 o'clock or 9:30 at night, then we're out until midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning together, because that's just Egyptians and that's the culture that we're in. And so church closures were horrible for us. It was just really, really hard to figure out how to be together when we can't be together. And the whole Zoom thing just doesn't work. We're not a technologically advanced culture, and we need to hear each other's voices. We're a very touchy culture. We do a lot of hugging and kissing. And so COVID has really taken a toll on all of us. So to come back into the pulpit and speak not just about the personal relationship of being children of God, but of being the family of God, of being co-heirs with our big brother, of having our inheritance be so guaranteed and solid and affirmed in who Christ is, was just a way of retying the knots, if you want to call that, and then having the sermon lead into the Lord's Supper was really, for me, what solidified the whole concept of we really are children, brothers and sisters of Christ, and this will never be taken away from us. No matter what the suffering is right now, the glory that is yet to come doesn't even compare to whatever it is that we're going through now. What is coming is so much more and so much greater. So for me, it was a very personal message, but it was also a very familial word of affirmation for my family of God in Cairo.
Okay, great. So we see, Ann, that when I give you a sermon title, you go with it, all right? Because I knew all of that stuff was going to happen when I gave you that title in September. I really did.
You're good, Scott. You're good.
I tell you. Anyway, that's amazing. So thank you for sharing that. I'm so grateful that you recovered. as well. And you didn't pass it on, right? No, nobody else in your family got it, right? Well, thankful.
Thankfully, no.
Okay, it's a quirky virus, but thankful that you are healthy. Najla, you had the next passage of the verses 18 to 25, which is a text that speaks of longing and eager expectation. And I think your context in Beirut, your sermon was wonderfully contextual. But please talk about that and everything that's been going on also in your community.
I had the challenge that Anne had about the title. So I mentioned it at the end to reconcile that. I live in Beirut, and really the last year has been very difficult year for us. I serve between Lebanon and Syria, and I work with younger generation in the church, youth, women, training, several kinds of training. So really this text is a text that challenges us living in the context of the Middle East. How do you reconcile suffering and glory? How do you live between suffering and hope? It's easy to speak about hope when we are in acceptable times. But how would you speak about hope for a family that in few minutes lost their home, lost their work? Lebanon, now we are in total lockdown. We have no empty beds for coronavirus patients. How would you speak about hope to people who have lost, the currency is devalued in Lebanon? So in a very short time, after being struggling with the war in Syria, now here we are in Lebanon with all the challenges. And really this text echoed the questions that I hear from the young people. Come on, you talk about hope. Tell us, how do we live it? And this is why I found this text not an easy text, really, because sometimes we see hope as a cushion word. As Fred Craddock says, you just postpone things, Let us be in hope. It's a cushion word. And many times, when we don't want to face reality, we just hope for later. The struggle of the young people, and my struggle as a person who works with these young people, how do we live with the now? Where is the glory now? Where is the hope now? And this is when the word of God speaks to people in their daily life. Yes, for sure, we wait for hope that will come, immortality being with Christ. But there is hope that we live today. And unless the church, the young people are convinced that there is hope, how would we survive in the Middle East? Nothing is moving forward. And it has been for a while. And the pandemic added for that. So the message of hope. And this is where this text speaks about beautiful images, the image of the woman who's delivering a baby, knowing the pain, but at the same time expecting that the baby will come. And this is where the attitudes, some people preach with this text just as a pill for letting people wait for later. No, I think we are called through this text to see the work of God today among us and to wait to hear the baby born among us. This is why I feel that the difference when we are locked with our pain, and I use the word amal, like you want hope, but you're totally locked in your pain. And the time when we feel that, yes, in the middle of our pain, there is a new start. And we have experienced this as a church in Lebanon and in Syria. We have experienced the strength that God gives at these moments. So the text really spoke to me. And yes, we don't know the exact times, but we wait with eager expectation that something will happen. And I want to say, for example, in Syria, the church today is stronger than it was before. Despite the pandemic, despite in Lebanon, the youth life has changed when the explosion happened. They felt like you cannot live your faith just indoors. You go on the streets, you help people. And this has shaped their understanding about hope. My main focus that I learned through this text is that sometimes we feel there is hope when we have meaning. And this is why I could live in a peaceful country and I don't have meaning. But when I live the will of God in the midst of suffering, this meaning gives us hope. And this is why many Lebanese, they don't want to leave, because they feel they have the hope in us to be able to live together. We are a diverse community of Christians and Muslims, to be able to live together. And the scene of living in one room with mirrors, where I see my image and I see the image of the others and their pain. And to be in the Middle East, to be in Lebanon, is to be in this room with mirrors, where we see the reflection of others' struggles and pain. To be in hope is to be in that room, is to be able to see the struggles of others. And I think all of us around the world, we are in these moments of being able to reflect on the struggles of others. My sermon taught me a lot myself about how that, yes, we are living in hope despite all, because we are learning to wait in eager expectation. We trust that something will happen in the now, and we trust that there is meaning for us. And the last point that was in my sermon, I'm part of a minority church, and to be a minority does not mean that we are not hopeful, because hope comes with little many times. It's a person who's dedicated. And this is where, I end my sermon by the last string, is to be able to play the last string, even when everything has changed. The struggle of living hope, and as the president of the World Communion of Reformed Churches, this is my challenge as well. When we talk about justice, we talk about hope, how do we live it practically? So yes, this sermon pushed me to go practical about how do we live hope today, and to see how God is using us, and to rejoice. We are in the already and not yet glory, and we are in the already and not yet hope. And I believe this is what keeps the church going here. We see glimpses of hope. We are in hope, and we see the glimpses of glory. Thank you.
Thank you. Angela, while you're talking, just real quickly, I mean, obviously the world's attention was riveted to Beirut with the video of that terrible explosion. But then, the world kind of moves on. But I'm sure, what are the lingering effects yet of that explosion?
Many people still are homeless. You don't see it on the news. People get motivated for some time, and then people are helped to have their food. It will take time, and the economic crisis is what adds to that people don't have money to rebuild their homes. We are starting, many people are still in need. We are very concerned with every ship that comes to our port now, because we're always worried what is there in these ships that this explosion happened. Till now, we don't know how it happened, why it happened. We know well that people are suffering and still suffering in that. Unfortunately, we lost 4 big hospitals because of that explosion, at a time where we need every hospital. At the same time, we lost many doctors who left because they could not find work here. So yes, we're still in the process of the aftermath of August 4th. And now we are in total lockdown. We hope that we will have the vaccine. And I think the injustice that is very clear in the world, where the rich can have vaccines and the poor cannot, is a struggle that those who are affected till now. We have no vaccine in Lebanon, and I know many countries around who cannot afford it. So yes, we are in the struggle in that.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, praying for you all. Thank you. Eric had the next passage, which dovetails well here in terms of the groaning of the creation and our eager expectations, working for the good. So Eric, talk a little bit about your context there in Princeton and yeah, how the passage hit you and how the sermon developed.
Sure, thanks, Scott, and thanks for all the marvelous background until these sermons already benefited from greatly. It's extraordinary to hear what else went into them. So I'm a professor here at Princeton Seminary, and since the pandemic struck, we've been in a lot of ways a dispersed campus. So our aspiration here is to be a residential campus, and although many of our students are still here, in all of our classes, all of worship life, everything is happening remotely. So that was part of the context. That's one big key in this, is that we are a residential community now spread out in all our individual apartments and homes. Second is, I was a student here in the early 2000s, and when I came back on faculty in the fall 2016, the biggest difference I felt here was the diversity of our students. So the racial and ethnic diversity had grown quite significantly in the time that I'd been away. And alongside of that came a great deal of ecumenical diversity as well, a diversity of expression and worship in chapel in particular. So that's the context. And usually as a professor, I get to preach into this community once a year. So you kind of get one shot to share what's on your heart and what God has led you to share. And this is a community that relishes words. I mean, like the libraries across the street, there's an untold number of words there. And that's the currency that really works here. So when I started turning to this passage along with Martin Tell and Jan Ammon and Melissa Haupt, who are just extraordinary partners in this work here at the seminary, we got caught up by that gap between what we know and what we don't know. So Paul says, we know that God works together good, and yet we don't know how to pray. And that space between what we know and what we don't know is what caught me up. The second thing that caught me up was that phrase, all things work together for good, and the ways that a sentence meant to heal has so often been used to rub further salt into people's wounds, right? To move on. Is this kind of cheap hope that some of us have already been talking about in this session? So those were the places I went. And the other thing that caught me, has been with me throughout this season, and I've been preaching, weirdly, a lot of Romans text recently. So I'm a Luke Acts scholar. So if I get options, I just run to the Gospel of Luke, I run to Acts. There's all kinds of things to say there. But for some reason, it's been Romans that I keep getting handed or keep being drawn to. And part of what I'm seeing in Romans is something about the weight of the promises that Paul's articulating there that God has made. That these are not easy promises. They're not cheap promises. They're not promises that, I think I say in the sermon, that we cash in like a warranty for a product we bought. These are promises borne by the marginalized. And that marginalized communities, here I'm thinking particularly in the United States, thinking about Latinx communities and queer communities and African-American communities, the way those communities have borne the promise of God and embodied it in vibrant ways. So I think that's the other piece that was with me in this work. So two more things briefly. One is, as we started thinking together, is what can we do online that we couldn't do otherwise? So if we were at the chapel in a regular residential semester, or if we were to travel to Michigan and do this work, what is it that we could do differently here? And part of what we could do differently is to be in different parts of the seminary campus. So the sermon is this traveling sermon taking us to different places, and to think about the particularity of those places and the way that worship, especially wordless worship, can happen in all these different spaces. That worship doesn't belong just in the chapel. It certainly happens there regularly, but the way that wordless worship kind of finds its way into all kinds of different spaces of the seminary. So part of the motivation too of having those different spots for the sermon was to move away from spaces predominated by words. So the pulpit, from where we start, and to all these other places, including the steps of the chapel, where all kinds of wordless hopes are enunciated by our students and by our faculty in our community. So those are a couple of places that we went. And like I said, I think it's been a surprise for this person who likes to hang out in Luke Acts to be spending so much time with the Romans, but there's something about the weight of the promises that God makes and the weight that we inherit from people who've gone before us that has really lingered with me.
Great, thank you. We'll say at one point while I was watching your sermon, you were going a certain direction. I thought, hey, Eric really ought to quote Kate Bowler next. And then you did. Uh, so
I try to quote Kate Bowler as often as possible.
yeah. Well, particularly with that passage, you had it really, really well. And then now to Luke, and again, a lot of the people watching haven't seen your sermon yet, but you have the crescendo text from the end of Romans. So yeah, you can talk about your context, but also how the text struck you, and give us, those of us, some of us on this call have already heard your sermon, but those who haven't, you can give a little teaser to up your viewership this afternoon.
Sure. I'll try not to give the sermon away. Okay. I'm here at Duke University. When we recorded the service, it was All Saints Sunday, so November 1st. And what's happened here, so I was on sabbatical in the spring when COVID started, and I came back in July. And the impact of the pandemic across the university, like many other universities, financially, just operationally, things are on, a lot of classes are online. We are not having gatherings for worship. So worship has moved to online. My whole staff is working remotely, except a few of us come on Sunday mornings, which is what you saw, a couple of ministers, musicians, the videographer, we gathered. And so we're in this, basically cathedral, neo-Gothic cathedral, preaching to the empty church, in many ways, which has been, it was a transition for me because for me, I came off a sabbatical into it. People were already in the rhythms, and I was still adjusting in the fall. So you have the impact of the pandemic, of the health pandemic, because there are pandemics. But then we have All Saints. So thinking about what All Saints Sunday and the remembrance and the communion of saints, trying to bring that. Plus, it was right before the election in the United States. It was the Sunday before the election. And so you have this overarching context, at least within this country, of the kind of political polarization and tensions at play. And so all of that was in the backdrop, and the university context here, and Duke University Chapel, which faculty, staff, community members, a lot of people from the region, students, it's a mix, as you might expect at a university. As we think about the political spectrums, theological spectrums, it's just that, right? And in that environment, you get the cheers and the jeers you get the praise and the rage, on one sermon. But for this particular passage, which I love, I tried to, in the sermon, think about the whole. So I'm at the end of the climax, as you say, Scott, and the crescendo, but to try to think of the whole, where for me, it's kind of a movement from the groaning all the way to the glory. And the glory is that glory of God's love. But yet there's this truthfulness. So what I try to develop in the sermon is thinking about the groans of the pandemics and, our sort of realities that we're enduring, whether it's health, whether it's been the racialized realities, whether it's the political tensions, the groaning, much groaning that's been happening, but then making a turn and really thinking about, well, what are we really groaning for ultimately as human beings? And, I basically try to sort of paint the picture that we're groaning for love. At the end of the day, we're groaning for God's love. And it's that love, regardless of the pandemics, regardless of, the tensions, that nothing's going to stop God's love. And so just as Paul, rhetorically, there is this sort of what I call the hymnic homiletic, this movement, this climax, this crescendo. I try to develop my sermon in that same way, to follow that movement, so that there is this crescendo of God's love and celebrating God's love at the end of the day. I mean, I do say it at the sermon, but I'm making a point. that I'm casting a vote before the election, and my vote is for love. And I think what we've seen in this nation from that time into this day is still a truthful, honest word. We need God's love. And the challenge of that, the hope of that, the truthfulness of that, because at the end of the day, we see what the logic of love with Jesus on the cross. It kills somebody, right? You die for love. And anyway, I just, so my imagination with the end of Romans sort of pushed me, nudged me in that direction at such a national moment, particularly in the US, because of the timing of All Saints as well, right before the election was really prominent in my mind. But thinking about what the saints is the last thing I'll say. This is nothing new for the saints. Nothing new under the sun for them. All of our ancestors and those, the clouds of witnesses, however you want to say it, have been through pandemics, you know, and so finding encouragement from St. Paul on that particular Sunday was also important.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, well, and thank you for your sermon too, Luke. And again, I encourage everybody watching who hasn't seen it to tune in at 3 today, or it'll be available as recorded content right after that too. But yeah, the end of your sermon made me want to stand up and shout. So I did, but then my earbuds fell out, so I had to sit back down. But anyway, well, thanks to all of you. I want to open it up now. I want to also remind those watching that if you want to post a question for any individual person or for all of the panelists, you can put it in the chat, or there's a Q&A function as well. I'll try to keep an eye on that. But I want to open it up to the 5 of you for a moment. If any of you want to comment on something somebody else said, if any of you want to ask another person a question, please do so. You know, you can unmute yourselves and just sort of have a conversation. I can come up with some more questions. Or I've got a sermon right here that I could read for all of us if you don't talk. So I'm sure you're going to want to talk now. But just sort of open it up and see if anybody wants to comment on anything or anything that struck any of you, or a question you want to ask of each other. And again, for those tuning in, if you want to post up a question for anybody or everybody, please do, and I'll keep an eye on that. Yeah, Eric, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. One of the things I was struck by in hearing all the sermons is how many of us touched on the question of the passage, right, of the groaning of all creation. So here I'm thinking at least of Najla and Luke and I, we all had, and I think others did too, like we all had to go through that text, even though it wasn't assigned to us. And I remember when I was preparing, I was like, this is stealing somebody else's thunder, but I couldn't talk about what I wanted to talk about, but what it means to work together for good for those who love God without talking about the groaning of all creation, especially in this moment when that groaning feels so tangible in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of the protests that we saw this summer. And also then in light of all these other crises that too many of us have forgotten. And I'm so grateful for the reminder, for that vivid reminder of the explosion in Lebanon and other things that we just kind of put aside because they're not in front of us all the time. So I'm really grateful for that reminder that groaning is there. And I wonder if, whether it's, and I think here I'm thinking about Luke, the end of Luke's sermon as well, like to get to love, right? That if we get there right away, if we jump to the end of Romans 8 and not go with Paul from the beginning of chapter 1, right? Where he starts with that confession and then he takes us to the bottom of where sin takes us and then leads us through this whole narrative. If we jump to the end of chapter 8, we miss the journey that gets Paul there. The narrative journey they have to take, and especially that narrative journey that's listening carefully to the groaning of all creation. If we jump to love, if we jump to all things work together for good without kind of, in a sense, earning, that's not the right word, right? But like earning our way into that confession. And I think this is part of what I was talking about earlier, the weight of God's promises is that they come with that experience that people before us have had. That these things that feel unprecedented are deeply precedented, actually. And they're in the groans of creation. And if we can listen to those, that wordless worship, if we can listen to what's come before us, it doesn't make our pain go away, but it reminds us that that pain is echoed throughout creation. And it's a pain, it's a groan that God hears, and it's a pain within which God makes God's promises, not over against that experience of loss and pain. So I was struck by how many of us had to come back to that little part of Romans 8 in order to preach what we felt called to preach.
Yeah. It reminds me of a great line from the play and film Shadowlands about C.S. Lewis and the loss of his wife. And at one point, Joy Davidman, his wife, has this line, you know, the sorrow now is part of the joy later. That's the deal. I think we do want to fast forward to the end of Romans 8. I sometimes wonder if some of the tension in a lot of churches, stuff that's just grinding a lot of pastors into hamburger of late, is that a lot of Christians who have relied on the pat answers, they can't, it's not working. The pandemic is, and the racial reckoning, it's undone us, it's unmade us. So pat answers don't work anymore. But thanks for that.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I find just on the groaning, what I find is it's not just the groaning of all creation, but one of the things that struck me, Gordon Fee talks about in his translation about the spirit who intercedes with sighs too deep for words can also be translated inarticulate groanings. So God even groans with all of us and with all of a creation. And for me, that's liberating. That the suffering we see in Beirut or in this country or in Egypt or in other, you know, that God gets down with us in the groan. And you got to go through the groaning, through what Eric's saying, to get to the glory. And maybe the glory's in the groaning. It's that one string, which is a beautiful image, my sister, that from that artwork, that one string, woo! I was with you. I was with you. I have to say that one string and how often that's, you know, the devastation of the world is so vast, right? But hope is often just that one little string, or what J. Alfred Smith says, that tiny sprout growing up in cracked concrete. Sometimes it's so small, but it's still there. Right? It's still looking to be plucked, and there's still a melody and a song. Anyway, thank you for that image that I will hold on to, even as, you know, I live as a human being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Najla.
Yes. One of the interesting things, looking at the text, you know, because today the word is sharing a suffering, you know, for the first time in my life, we are all experiencing some kind of similar suffering. The corona has made us all understand, you know, although we are in different contexts. And, you know, with the lockdowns, with stopping our calendars, with everything, one of the interesting we are subjected to futility. And I went into this real meaning of this word. It's like you're not living up to what you want to be as a Christian or as a person. And I was thinking that this is a pain that we all share, you know. I've lived in war all my life, but there is a special kind of pain that we are all sharing now. This lack of meaning, lack of living up to your potentials, living up to your call, to your faith. We are in moments of, we are not able. And I think this is part of the groaning that we are all sharing. And I think we will groan more when we discover what happened to us after the corona. Because, you know, I think when the vaccine is in and everybody, when we get out to go back to our life, we will discover we are new people. We will discover we have a new church. The church is changing at this time. And this is part of the groaning that we will be. It is like we are shaken to be reshaped again in something beautiful that God is asking, despite all the pain, you know. And this futility to be living below what is expected from you, of your abilities, I think is the struggle that we all share, wherever we are. There is something that's suppressing us. And we just feel like we want to get out of this situation. In that, we understand we are unified in pain. Unfortunately, there's nothing beautiful about pain. But there is some kind of unity that I understand what Anne is going through when she was locked in one room, she cannot get out and all that. This sharing of this. And we all feel like, oh, what will we do after the pandemic? Now, as a communion, we are starting to see Corona and beyond, what will happen to us. And I'm sure we are changing, and we will change in the coming days in that. I just want to say to my sister Anne, I loved her sermon, and I loved Anne and I struggle about the role of women in the Middle East. And in her sermon, she says that, the inheritance of the men and the oldest son. And Anne, I thought when you had the first time I connected it, like sometimes people feel like the inheritance in the church is for the men. And we struggle with that in the Middle East about the inheritance is for everybody. And it is, in the Middle East, the sons inherit differently. But with the Bible, when we are in the spiritual, beyond our physical, when we are in the spirit, we should all inherit equally in that. Inherit the responsibility, the positions, the ordination, and I thought this is a strong word for us in the Middle East. I appreciated what you shared, and I saw it from this corner. But when we are in the spirit, we cannot stay like that. We cannot keep the inheritance for the men. And at the end, we will all leave. And I like what you said, even the son gave it to all in that. This will be my next sermon, Anne. Thank you.
And then we have a question, two of them actually, that are addressed to Najla, but any of you can jump in. We had one person who wrote that they live in the Bahamas, where they're still recovering from Hurricane Dorian from 2 years ago, and then every year brings more hurricanes, and it seems kind of relentless. How can we live in hope? And then somebody else just posted a question in the chat that said, you in particular, Najla, talked about not relegating hope to the future, but to today. So how and so any of you, I suppose, how can we find hope, live hope concretely when nothing in our circumstances gives us any reason to hope? I guess Paul addresses that elsewhere, right? When he says, well, if we already had it, we wouldn't have to call it hope. You hope for what you don't have, but how can you feel it concretely is what a couple of these questions have asked. So that Najla or anybody can have at that.
Yeah, I would say briefly, because I want others to share. For example, when we have a community who are caring for each other, this is a sign of hope. When people cannot, in the time, we had children opening their piggy banks and donating them to the people who lost their homes. I felt that was hope. Yesterday, I had a call of a woman who's a young woman who's diabetic. She has corona. We ran out of medication. And she needed cortisone. I don't know what you call it. So I went around and was able to find a small box of a cortisone for her. And I called my husband and I called her husband. And I gave it to him. And he was saying, I said to my husband also, who's a pastor, I said, Joseph, is this the gospel also? Is this the gospel for this young woman who was worried about her health to find this? These are small things, but when you do them, you feel that God is with us. And it gives strength that, yes, we will continue in that. I know finding hope is to discover each other's willingness to live like Jesus. And it seems through pain, we discover it in a deeper way. It's not the most beautiful way, but it seems there is this discovering. Pain is so much connects us to, challenges us to look like Jesus, to live like Jesus, and to share. And when you share, you just have have a meaning that is given to you, that yes, I tried to do what Christ would do in my place in that. These are moments of hope. But they might not change the reality, but they change us. And they make us different Christians, deeper Christians in that.
Many of us on this call know Paul Scott Wilson's work, The 4 Pages of the Sermon, the 4th page of which page is Grace in the World. And one thing I tell my students, and used to be one of them, is, you know, some preachers struggle to find an example of grace today. And often they struggle because they think it has to rise to the level of Mother Teresa or handwriting on the wall or skywriting or fireworks, spiritual fireworks. And I always, you know, love the line of Saint Teresa of Avila, look for Christ among the pots and pans. Grace in the world is a box of cortisone. That is the gospel. A potato chip crusted tuna casserole somebody brings to a sick neighbor in love. That's the gospel. That's hope. So I like it. Others want to jump into that. There was also another question. A lot of people think Romans and the letters, the epistles, are kind of difficult to relate to. They're too academic. And so how do we make a letter like Romans accessible to people? That was another question. So anybody can jump on that. In the minutes, we have a few minutes left. Anybody can jump on that or anything else.
Yeah, I found with Romans that the more you can place it in the story of Paul, and, you know, just read everything Eric's written about Acts, and the more you can show, like, this is an actual human being who's writing to actual human beings, and he believes that what he is saying is a matter of life and death. So he's not writing like, here's some things to think about, like, just ponder this. He's writing like, look, you need to understand how the Jews and the Gentiles and all this story, you need to understand all of this because it's going to make a difference in how you, Reuben, treat this person, Theodosius, who, right? So it's this very much this, I'm telling you this so that you live differently. And when we take giant chunks of Romans and try to get people to understand them just conceptually, I think we're shortchanging Paul's intention. And what I love to do when I preach is just kind of imagine who are these people and what are their problems and how does that tie to us and our problems, and look what God did there and look what God does here, right? So it's this very take bite-sized passages. And one of the great things about these sermons is it was like bite-sized chunks of Romans 8, right? Which allowed us to spend some time with that. And so I find with Romans, the more I can place it in a context that connects with my hearers, the less it seems just kind of theological, blah, 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 and more it seems like, oh, this will make a difference in how I live. Yeah. So for what it's worth.
Yeah, I like that. And
I like what Mary said about, you know, treating Paul as the human being that is writing to other human beings. But I think something else that you do really well, Mary, and you did it again in the sermon, is that when you preach on the epistles and the harder theological texts, you have a really smart way of just naturally fitting it with some gospel story. Yeah. So you did it again in this sermon where you brought in the woman and Jesus looks at her and you created that scene. Right. And then the same word that you started out with, and you know, that voice of condemnation, and then neither do I condemn you. That to me was it bridged that illustration with the concept. Or maybe it just made the concept so much more real. And I think this is a beautiful skill that you do in your sermons, how you tie the Gospels with the rest of the writings. And sometimes you pull in Old Testament stories that make the concept so life-giving. So that's a skill that ought to be taught.
Thank you, Anne. That's very kind.
If I might add also, it's literally biblical that Paul is hard to read. It's in 2 Peter. It's already in there. Like, so you're in good company in thinking this. I think a couple of things that have been working for me recently is to think about Romans, for example, as this narrative, to think about the story that Paul is narrating. So too often I think our preaching tends to think about what are the big ideas here, and like we're going to this good doctrine or that doctrine. But I think actually more interesting and more truer to what Paul is doing in Romans is telling a story about God's faithfulness from the beginning to the end. And it kind of inviting people into the story that Paul's weaving instead of like the big ideas that Paul's narrating. Here, really helpful to me has been the work of Catherine Grebe, who's got a little commentary on Romans that's marvelous. And also then, of course, the work of my teacher, Beverly Gaventa. She's got a book called When in Romans that has been really helpful to me as well. So to kind of think about those more actually it's something that Mary was doing, right? Like it's a story that Paul is telling rather than a series of confessions that we have to analyze deeply along the way. If we do it that way, it's just really hard. The last thing I'll say is I kind of have this hunch that Paul's letters were often more like Philemon than there were Romans, the kind of long, complicated letters. Paul is interested in stuff on the ground. Paul is confessing something about the character of God in order to shape how we live together. So let your sermon be guided in that way too. This is, what are we saying about God? And therefore, if we say this about God, then what does that mean for how we live lives in these complicated times? So that's my advice there.
One of the things that we've seen all around the world during the pandemic is pastors who were preaching to empty sanctuaries. They started getting photos of members of the congregation. Sometimes they blow them up to almost be life-size and tape them to the pews so they could see people. And that's what I love about Romans. You get to Romans 16, and the letter ends with this list of all these people whom Paul greets by name. And as Fred Craddock said in a sermon on that, Fred, don't call it a list. It's not a list, right? I mean, these are the living people that were in front of Paul's eyes, as it were, when he wrote the whole letter. This wasn't academic. This was to Tryphosa and to, the other names. Mary mentioned a couple of them. That makes that, so epistles seem to be context-less, but it's not true. Letters always have a context. Well, we are at our time. We have done this for almost a full hour now. So I want to thank all of you and in absentia, Mark Laberton, for taking on the challenge of these Romans texts. We were going to do 5 originally, so I had 5 preaching texts, and then John Whitfleet said, no, we should do 6. John always wants to do one more. So then I had to rejig it. But thank you for taking on the challenge of those texts. Thank you for all of your sermons, and Mark as well. I think they spoke to people all over the world and will continue to speak as this lives on as now content on the Worship Institute's website, and it'll be on the Center for Excellence in Preaching website. And I think the ministry of all 5 of you and of Mark is going to live on. So to all of you who have tuned in this morning, thank you very, very much. God bless you. Remember, Luke's service is live today at 3 o'clock. And remember, basically, with only a few exceptions, all the content that's been going on this whole month is going to be archived on the Worship Institute website to be watched and viewed over and over. So thanks to all of you who are saying thanks to us in the chat. And the rest of you, God bless your day. Thanks for joining us this morning. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you. God bless. Thank you.